From the very beginning, the big cosmic conflict between the semi-deities Hydaelyn and Zodiark has been at the heart of Final Fantasy XIV's story. And incredibly, the Endwalker expansion delivers a powerful ending to that story, and one that should remove any doubt that Square Enix's MMORPG spins one of the best Final Fantasy tales to date. All of that comes with a small but potent set of new classes and some outstanding boss battles. Endwalker picks up right where 2019's phenomenal Shadowbringers expansion left off, eventually resolving many unanswered questions in satisfying ways. Here, the Warrior of Light heads out with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn as they hunt for a way to destroy towers that the nefarious Ascians have summoned to bring about the end of the world. The following 50 or so hour journey takes us to many locations we've heard mentioned but never visited, be they the scholarly city-state of Sharlayan, the South Asia-inspired island of Thavnair, or the frozen waste of Garlemald. And yes, Endwalker eventually takes us to the moon, but if you want an idea of how wild it gets, that's not even the craziest of places you'll go. One great strength of Endwalker's story is how successfully it subverts ideas of how this years-long story would come to an end. While it's overall less personal than what we saw in Shadowbringers, its strongest moments are those that highlight the impact of war and strife at an individual level. In the process, the writing ventures in the dark places that other MMO stories would hesitate to go, and it handles them well. Its moments with the main villains initially come off as a tad weaker, but the ending brings their arcs to conclusions that are both surprising and satisfying. Endwalker's story works so well in part because it's carried by carefully crafted cutscenes so extensive that they often last 15 minutes or more. You could skip them technically, but the voiced ones in particular are so integral to the plot that doing so runs the risk of missing out on essential information or finding yourself in strange new places with no idea of how you got there. Taken together, they take longer to watch than whole seasons of many popular TV shows, but it's a testament to the strength of Endwalker's writing that only a few feel like a drag to watch.
Was your curt dismissal truly the best you could offer?
Much of your time outside the cutscenes involves simply running from one point to another. The advantage of this approach is that the storyline isn't tarnished by the ridiculous scenarios other MMOs come up with to justify asking you to kill X of Y enemy, and many quests have non-combat objectives. Some of these work better than others. My favorite style of new quest simply has you walking around with NPCs and chatting with them for a bit of extra lore. Less successful are the new stealth missions that make you trail an NPC but end immediately if your quarry spots you. No one liked those in the old Assassin's Creed games and are no better here. The absolute worst quest technically involves little more than finding specific people to chat with in a village, but they're sometimes so hard to find that I felt like I spent half an hour on it. Mercifully, such moments are rare in Endwalker, and their memory is often swiftly shoved aside with some awe-inspiring sight or a tearjerker cutscene. Square Enix complements this masterful storytelling with some of the most intriguing combat classes it's introduced in years. So far, my favorite is the Reaper, a surprisingly intuitive DPS class that swooshes through enemies with a gigantic scythe and calls upon a wraith to aid in battle. It's flashy, it's heavy-hitting, and yet it's surprisingly simple, and it's a fun new way for newcomers to finish their journey to the new level cap of 90. The new Sage job is considerably more challenging, as it's all about keeping barriers on allies and healing friends by doing damage to enemies. It plays like a combination of Scholar and White Mage, and honestly, I'm still getting the hang of it. But I can tell from watching more experienced healers that it's a rewarding powerhouse in the right hands. Beyond that, Endwalker doesn't add much to the traditional Final Fantasy XIV gameplay. The bosses for trials and dungeons are some of the best I've ever fought in this game, but the dungeons themselves still involve little more than jogging down a very pretty corridor from one boss to the next. Considering some of the places we go in Endwalker, I'm surprised Square Enix wasn't more creative with their design. Fortunately, Endwalker does much to make up for the absence of big new features with a pile of welcome quality of life improvements. Some are small, like the way mini-maps now pop up when you use the fast travel network in cities. Others are more substantial, such as how the pile of abilities needed for gathering collectibles has been replaced by an intuitive minigame. Even combat classes got some much needed love. Summoner, for instance, went from being one of the most complicated DPS classes to one of the simplest, while retaining everything that made it appealing in the first place, and then some. I'm especially pleased that my Samurai's AoE rotation is simpler, and monks no longer have to worry as much about standing in specific spots to deal the most damage. Endwalker delivers a powerful, emotional story with some bold choices, but it's important to understand that you'll get the most out of it if you've been with these characters from the beginning. And with roughly 50 hours of story piled on the hundreds in the expansions that came before it, its barrier to entry is now so high that, well, it almost reaches the moon. But if you've been on that journey for a while now, this is an expansion well worth seeing to its end. Packed with meaningful story cutscenes and unforgettable new zones, Endwalker marks a satisfying conclusion of Final Fantasy XIV's story as we've known it until now. While it doesn't introduce many new gameplay elements, it does deliver 2 new excellent DPS and healing jobs that should appeal to both new and experienced players, and some of the best boss battles we've seen in this decade-old game. If this is how Final Fantasy XIV's showrunners end a story, then I'm more than ready to walk with them from the beginning to the end of the next one. For more on Final Fantasy, watch our tour of some of Endwalker's new areas and a review of 2019's expansion, Shadowbringers. And for everything else, stick with IGN.